We're getting ready to discuss the early civilizations that developed around the area of Mesopotamia, which is located between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. And this was an area that's also called the Fertile Crescent. It lies between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and those rivers help to provide really good soil and irrigation for crops in those areas. So that these civilizations could emerge and develop. So I want you to look at the next couple of slides and kind of talk about the ideas that had to evolve for people to become advanced in civilization. And you're going to learn exactly how those ideas evolved in these early civilizations in Mesopotamia. Now that you've had a chance to look and see how the geography of the area in Mesopotamia affected those civilizations, I want you to take a minute and turn to a partner and discuss the area where you live and what role geography plays in how your area has developed physically, commercially, and culturally. Cities like had civilizations we call the Sumerians. And the Sumerians did something really cool. They kind of developed an irrigation system so that that would help in agriculture and they could create a food surplus. They also built these walls that were made out of mud and bricks. And they used these also to build houses. And they invented this arch type of architecture and a dome, and it created something called a ziggurat. This is like a temple where it was kind of the center in each society. A theocracy is a government style where you have your religious beliefs intertwined with your laws. In fact, the religion piece really kind of directs the laws. The Sumerians believed that gods ruled the city-states through kings, and they believed that's where the kings got their power from. One of the reasons that the Sumerians developed this polytheistic form of religion was that because the climate of Mesopotamia was so harsh, with heavy rains, winds, and famines, and even unpredictable flooding that could be deadly, they believed that these supernatural forces controlled their world. And so they gave, each force was a different god. So there were eventually over 3,000 gods and goddesses in the Sumerian civilization. It was really kind of the way they explained their environment and their lives and how things occurred. So turn to a partner and tell your partner, why did the people of Mesopotamia believe that supernatural forces controlled their world? The Sumerian city-states had three major social groups. They had nobles, commoners, and slaves. The nobles, these were the kings and the priests and their families. And then farmers, fishermen, merchants, and craftspeople made up the common social class. And then the Sumerians also had slaves, and they belonged to the temple and palace officials and even to rich landowners who used them to farm. So now that you've seen the social structure of these early civilizations, who do you think held the most power and why? So turn to your partner and tell your partner who you think had the most power and give them an example as to why that is. Well, the Sumerians didn't go for very long without writing. They came up with a writing style called cuneiform. And this was wedge-shaped writing, and they would keep records with it, and they made these records on clay tablets. It's kind of one of the first known record-keeping practices that we're going to see in these ancient civilizations. Eventually, this led to one of the most famous pieces of literature during this time period, and it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. So on your own, I would like for you to research what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. You can Google it or talk to a partner, but you and your partner get together, and I want you to tell your partner, what is the Epic of Gilgamesh and what is it about? Here you can see the architecture style that I discussed earlier with the ziggurat, and you can kind of see the structure. It's actually quite fascinating and very elaborate here. You can look and see how it starts up here at this level, but it comes all the way down, all the way here, so you have multiple levels. You can imagine what it took to build this for these early civilizations to be able to build something like this. Later on, the Sumerians were overtaken by another group called the Akkadians. And in the Akkadians, this is where we see the first kind of empire building. So you have a large political unit or a state, and you have like a single ruler. And so this is where we're going to see that those empires begin to develop. The Babylonians came along later, and they had an empire that they controlled in Mesopotamia, and their king was called Hammurabi, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about Hammurabi and what the Babylonian impact would be, especially for law in society in the coming years. Hammurabi was the leader of the Babylonians, and his most important achievement was his collection of laws called the Code of Hammurabi. The code was very unique at this time because it was developed around the principle of retribution. And so its laws kind of had a deal where it was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so the problem, was that lower class people would be punished a little bit more severely than the upper class people, because in his laws, upper class people were allowed to pay a fine to get out of the actual punishment. And most of the laws in the Code of Hammurabi focused on marriage and family. Mesopotamia was a patriarchal society, meaning it was dominated by men. Men ruled wives and children, and a woman who neglected her home, according to Hammurabi's code, could be drowned. A child who struck his father, according to the Code of Hammurabi, could have his hand cut off. So it's quite harsh that we see these new laws in the early ancient years with the Code of Hammurabi. So you can kind of get an idea from these examples how harsh it is. What impact do you think the Code of Hammurabi will have on future law? So keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, it created a single code of laws that were both objective and had punishments. Number two, the laws also created some stability, and people could kind of predict the outcome. And number three, it was the first uniform law code, and it created a kind of a shift from men ruling people to people being ruled by laws. So how do you think that the rule of law is going to change over time, beginning with the Code of Hammurabi? This is going to be a common theme throughout history. So start with the Code of Hammurabi, and when we move on to other law codes that develop over time, think back how those changes occurred and why. A couple of achievements that were created through the Sumerians were, of course, we have the cuneiform system of writing, and we see record keeping. The plow was invented, wheel, and so with the plow and the wheel, they were able to grow their crops better, more efficiently, and transport. So now you're going to see people spreading out further because transportation can exist. And they can carry materials over distances. The sundial is also created, the arch that we saw with the ziggurats. And then the tools are shifting. So we start out with very harsh tools, but now we've moved on to bronze tools.